Hey guys, it's the Duke, and in this week's vlog we're going to be talking about Biomutant, a game that prides itself on being a jack of all trades, yet ends up being a master of none. Biomutant is an open-world hack-and-slash game set in a post-apocalyptic Earth where humanity is no longer on the Earth, and yet life is thriving, evidenced by the fact that you have raccoons and rats and all kinds of other animals that know kung fu and have technology. The whole story revolves around the Tree of Life, this mystical tree that seems to be the key towards life existing on the planet, and how there are these four monsters called world enders that are trying to, well, end the world by eating the big roots of the tree. Apparently, eating the roots of the tree is going to signal the end of life on Earth, so it's a bad thing and you need to stop that. I'm sure there's more to the story, but if I'm honest with you guys, I found the story to be tremendously boring. And I found myself skipping a lot of narrative and exposition just because it's just not a very interesting story. And each character that tells you about the story or does something to advance the narrative just takes a really long time to get to the point. There's a lot of useless conversation here that really has nothing to do with what you're trying to do in the game. It just kind of is there. And so it ends up being really distracting, and I probably skipped past vital story moments and things like that, but, you know, again, it just wasn't interesting. So I wish I could say there's more to the story, but that's it. Also, on the topic of narrative, you have this narrator that kind of follows you around throughout the whole game, and at first it's funny and sometimes like witty, but most of the time it ends up just being annoying, or the narrator just says really obvious things, or eventually starts recycling dialogue because the narrator just doesn't shut up. But thankfully there are settings where you can reduce the frequency of the narrator talking or turn it off entirely, which I ended up doing because, again, I just kind of got sick of the narrator. When you're not advancing the main story, the game is full of fetch quests and collecting things. You need to go here, you need to do this, you need to collect this. The story missions are pretty much the same thing, except that they're a little tougher. Or maybe you have to go do a bigger of the same thing you've been doing the entire time. And the game follows a fundamental loop where it's go here, do this, collect this, get more powerful, and then fight a boss. And then you repeat that, well, 4 total times for all the bosses. Keeping that in mind, the game really isn't super deep. It's actually quite repetitive. On top of missions just being wholly uninteresting, the combat, which is the main thing you do in this game, is actually really, really janky. I did say it's a hack and slash, so you will be mashing X and Y on an Xbox controller. I don't know what it is on PC, but you will be mashing your main combat buttons, just trying to, you know, defeat all the enemies that are around you at any given point in time. You do have things like combos, and you can unlock special abilities to use with your various weapons. You also have ranged weapons that you can use, and of course you have powers, and I'll get to the powers in a little bit. But the thing about the combat is, there isn't really auto lock in the game to help you stay focused on a target. I mean, there sometimes is, especially when you're shooting, but most of the time you're kind of just hacking and slashing in the general direction of where enemies are. That's fine. I mean, there are plenty of hack and slash games that work on that same principle, but in this game, there's a lot going on, and sometimes you have flying enemies, and sometimes you have flying enemies with ground enemies that may be ranged, and you have this really big baddie that's throwing explosive barrels at you. It'd be nice to have auto lock or some way of being able to more carefully target, prioritize, that kind of thing, but the auto lock in this game is inconsistent at best. And especially on the topic of shooting, there are going to be plenty of times where you're just going to start shooting in a random direction, or the bullets are never going to be anywhere near where you're shooting at, all because there are various types of guns and they have different stats, of course, but again, like, for a game that wants you to be able to shoot and do melee attack and use your powers, it gets hard to do all those things if you don't have an auto lock system to benefit you. And then on top of all of that, there are critical hits which you can score with your guns, meaning that it's important to hit your enemies in certain places. It's really hard to do that. Sometimes the auto lock kicks in when you're trying to go for a headshot, and other times it's not there at all, but you're still missing. So it's just really hard to be able to do the combat in this game. You shouldn't be having to fight the game itself to fight the enemies within the game. And I just found myself doing that way too often. Eventually I got into a flow. I built a weapon that suited the playstyle that I liked, and then I learned a little bit more about how the combos work and your special kung fu power system. I can't remember what it's called. But eventually, once you learn how to use those things too, which the game doesn't do the best job of teaching you all of this, but once you develop that flow, the game gets a little bit easier to play. It's also hard to see when enemies are going to attack you for the block mechanic that's in there. You have like a block and a parry kind of mechanic, but you can't always see those attacks, so they're not always telegraphed. And other times you just have enemies that will nearly one-shot you, if not completely one-shot you. It's really all over the place. Now, yet another feather that this game is trying to have in its hat is that it's a loot game. There's a lot of loot to be found within the world. You need to look everywhere. Most of the loot is very uninteresting. It's not useful to you, but fortunately you can pretty much sell everything that you get. But where the loot actually becomes really important, it's not so much what you find, it's what you can do with the things that you find. The single best thing that the game does is its crafting system, and it is quite good. I have very high praise, effusive praise really, about the crafting system. The crafting system allows you to take all the various parts that you're finding, and of course, which you will find a lot, and you can make new weapons out of them. Some of these weapons look kind of ridiculous, like weapons that are made from toothbrushes, so, weapons that have plungers on them, or maybe a weapon that is a plunger. But these weapons, they can be very useful to you. You can just take all those parts you're finding, of course, there's various qualities of these parts, and then you can craft a weapon that works for you. You can even craft weapons in the field right as you're about to go into a big battle. So if you see that there's a big enemy coming up, maybe you want to take a look at all the loot that you've recently acquired and see if you can make just a small upgrade to your weapons. You can also do the same thing with armor. You can't make armor per se, but you can add items to your armor to give them stat increases, like increased defense, increased crit chance, maybe increased energy regeneration, things like that. So in other words, the crafting system is actually quite good. The only thing that makes this all possible is that you have the necessary components to be able to craft these new things or do these upgrades, which is where all of this useless loot comes in. Anything you find that can be broken down, and you'll actually be able to see the components that you'll get for breaking it down prior to that. So you can make a carefully weighted decision, do I want to sell this at the next vendor, or do I want to break it down? Now, knowing that there's loot everywhere, you're going to be spending a lot of time in menus sorting through loot, but as far as I know, I have not encountered an inventory limit, so that's also yet another positive thing. Now, keeping these things in mind, the various stats that you have, such as melee, damage, health, crit chance, all of those things, they're all affected by the pieces that you're wearing, whether it's armor or it's the weapons you're using. Knowing this, you're probably going to prioritize stats over aesthetics, so I don't know about you, but my character looked pretty dumb most of the time. You do have the ability to upgrade the quality of an item at certain vendors. It is pretty expensive to do, and it seems like the stat yield is really not that great. So most of the time, you're just going to pick the items that give the best stats rather than what looks the best until you can start making those more expensive upgrades. Another thing I think that's really positive about this game is the game is just very gorgeous looking. It's even relaxing at times. The game has a lot of really bright colors, a lot of green, a lot of some of the pastel colors that you might see. So it's not a bad looking game to look at. Everything looks really good, especially on high-end hardware. But keeping all of this praise in mind, and well, there is a lot of criticism really. I just spent like 3 minutes talking about the janky combat system. I couldn't bring myself to finish this game. At around the 20-hour mark, I had the feeling that I had seen everything there was to see in the game as far as content is concerned. Not necessarily having completed the game, but I've seen every type of quest that you could have done. I had beaten 2 of the 4 world enders, things like that. There are factions in the game, but they largely don't really matter because you can get as many morality points as you want to unlock the various powers. So because I'd seen everything I wanted to see, I don't know, I just really couldn't think of a reason to keep going, and this is the first game in a long time that I have not finished because I just got so bored. There was really nothing bringing me back to the game. I had a really awesome weapon. It was really, really powerful, and I unlocked that weapon pretty early on just because of RNG, and I have just been slightly upgrading each time, so there really hasn't been reason for me to keep crafting because nothing's better. So if crafting is the best thing about this game and it's not really benefiting my build anymore, I just couldn't really think of a reason to, keep going in the game. So I kind of abandoned it. Who knows? I could be missing out on something huge, but I'm at around the 30-hour mark, and I just don't see it getting better for me. And the thing that kept me in the game, I'd say the longest, wasn't necessarily the combat or the story, it was the promise of the powers. In a lot of the promotional material for Biomutant, they talked about all the cool powers you'd have that you could spec into. Well, I unlocked all those powers, and I gotta say, most of them are really unimpressive. There are powers that help you with traversal. Those are pretty useful, and I ended up using those most of the time, but your damage doing abilities are just pathetic, especially once you start speccing more into melee weapons. It makes me think I should have restarted the game pretty early on, but I don't know. Maybe I'll come back to this game again and do a completely different melee build. Who knows? Anyway, guys, I don't know. This game doesn't seem like it's worth a $60 price tag to me. To me, I played it on Origin Access Premier, or whatever they call it now, EA Play Pro, I guess, something. And it was free on there, so I figured, I'll give it a try. It was a nice little diversion. I put 30 hours in, and I enjoyed, I'd say, like 2/3 of that time. But I don't know if I could recommend buying this game. Now, if you're watching this video and you're saying, Jeremy, there is so much more to this game, please let me know in the comments below, and maybe I'll go back and look, but I just don't really see a reason to keep going. If you're interested in trying Biomutant, it is available on Origin. I think it's available on Steam. It's available on the consoles. You can find it in a lot of different places. But if you're on the fence like I was about it, and watching this video didn't really convince you, or maybe you still kind of want to try it, then I'd say bite the bullet on the EA Play Pro super subscription thing and maybe give it a try there and cancel your sub afterwards or something. I don't know. Anyways, I hope you guys liked this video. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all of that YouTube stuff. And if you'd like to stay connected with me, check out my Twitch, check out my Discord, all of which the links are below. Thanks for watching.